Hi guys, and welcome to the Highman Podcast. It's episode 9, I think. Today it is Wednesday, the 19th of October. Currently 12:16 p.m. How are we doing, Pete, today? All right?
Yeah, pretty good. It's good to be right back into another podcast. We did one the other day, so straight into another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Get the output nice and high.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be putting them out as often as us going forward. So see
Yeah,
how it goes.
yeah. Hopefully our schedules line up and we can keep it consistent. But today, anyway, we're going to try and do like a little mini dive into Stoicism. We're not experts on it at all, but we kind of like the idea of it and the philosophy behind it. So we're going to have like a dip our toes into the water of what it means to be a Stoic and like the philosophy of it, and then maybe explore it like in more detail in a later episode. But any thoughts on what we're going to say today, Pete? Or
Yeah,
should I dive
no,
into
that's
it?
good. I think a lot of the ideas from Stoicism actually go along with a lot of the ideas we've spoke about in previous episodes. So it'll be good sort of attacking them from a different angle and getting into it because I think this stuff is like really useful to people, especially in the modern day for people. So yeah, should be good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so uh, most of my source is most of the information I've got is from the source of like Ryan Holiday, who's well, in my eyes, like a world-renowned Stoic expert. He lives by the philosophy himself, like deeply. Um, but check him out, dailystoic.com. Shouts to him. So he kind of defines Stoicism and like talks about what it is, and he says it's not necessarily a focus on like ancient Greece or Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, but more so one thing that kind of encompasses it is what Epictetus said. Is that how you say his name? Epictetus.
Epictetus, I think.
Epictetus. There you go. And Epictetus quoted, "The chief task of the philosopher is to determine what is up to us and not what is up to us." And Ryan Holiday explains this as like we control how we respond to what happens to us. We don't control what happens to us. And then following up on that, he says everything that does happen to us is an opportunity for the individual to like display the four virtues of Stoicism, those being courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. So anytime you come across anything in your life that may seem good or bad, there's always an opportunity to take one of those four virtues. And then I think that Stoics maybe hold those virtues in the highest esteem above it all else. Um, but yeah, any thoughts on the definition and what it kind of encompasses?
Yeah, well, I think there was a lot to unpack there from what you said, but I think that one of the key elements that underlies everything in Stoicism is kind of focusing on what is in your control and not what is outside of your control. So you kind of said, regardless of what good or bad happens, there's always opportunity to do the right thing and exercise those virtues. So I think the key thing in Stoicism is to be detached emotionally from the occurrences of the external world and to kind of develop this kind of indestructible mindset because you don't have control over the external world, but you have complete control over your own mind and your own actions, and that's a freedom that no matter what external things people can take away from you, they can never take that freedom away from you. So it builds this kind of inner resilience and inner strength. So I
Yeah,
think that's the key aim of this philosophy is to develop that resilience and to become um, unaffected by outside things and to act in the right way in accordance with those virtues that Stoicism holds so highly.
yeah.
Yeah, to
Do you think that like when you talk about reacting to the world in a positive way, do you think that Stoics would possibly believe that you can control your emotions, or do they believe that you don't control your emotions but you control how you act on them? Like if something bad happens to you and you feel sad and depressed about it, do Stoics accept and agree that that should happen, but your actions should reflect other things, or do they kind of think that an individual is like a closed book and like doesn't have emotions in them at all? What do
well,
you think? Like,
Yeah, well, I actually just watched a really good video kind of about this, and it was talking about how the resilience and inner strength from Stoicism kind of comes from, like, you have multiple lines of defense. So you have some ability to control your emotions, but the thing with emotions is emotions can hit you before you even process that they have, before it even
Right.
comes into your thinking. And I think this is actually true on like a deep neurological level, that the feelings and experiences, um like the experience of the emotion hits you before you actually perceive consciously that you're experiencing that emotion. It goes beyond the kind of conscious awareness. So in that
Mhm.
sense, no, you can't control emotions. But the first line of defense, let's say, from the external world, yes, you can't control those direct emotions, but the Stoics have things they call passions, which are basically like one step removed from emotions, but which you do have control over them, and you can exercise control over them basically through like mental restraint. So we can talk about these passions. I've got them written down somewhere here. So the passions are distress, fear, lust, and delight. So these things are maybe like, I guess they are kind of emotions in a way, but they're like second, like they're like one step removed from the immediate emotion you feel. um and yeah, supposedly through mental restraint you can control these emotions.
Right, so they like the fundamental things that humans feel, and then like all the other emotions are kind of branched off from those. Is that what you're kind of trying to say?
Well, it's kind of the other way around. Like the fundamental emotions you might feel, yeah, like you'll feel fundamental emotions, but then these passions are one step removed, and you can control the passions through mental restraint. So I spoke about kind of the lines of defense. So that's your first line of defense. But it also says, sometimes, like, we're not perfect. We'll get into this later on, but they talk about how it's basically impossible to be I think they call it like the stoic sage, which is basically like the perfect complete stoic. It's impossible to be that. So there will be times where these passions seep through, or certain emotions take control of you, and that's when the second line of defense comes, which is, regardless of the emotions that you feel, you still have control over your own actions. So even when you're overcome with emotions, you can still act in a virtuous way. Obviously, ideally, it makes it easier to avoid falling into like negative actions, if you don't have the passions, like the like desire, or like fear or something. If you don't allow these things to seep in, then you're obviously less likely to take those actions. But even given that those things got in, that's when the next line of defense comes, which is basically your inner resilience and strength in order to make good decisions regardless of the emotions you feel. So there's sort of
Mm.
both elements to that. So it's not just one or the other. Like, it's not just that we're dictated by our emotions, or that we have complete control over your emotions. It's that we have some control, and if you were the perfect stoic, you probably would be able to control your emotions completely, but you can't. So there's like the next layer of defense. So given, maybe you fail and the emotions slip through, but given that circumstance, you still have the ability to control it. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah. What would you say is more difficult? Would you say it's more difficult to like block out these emotions altogether, or would you say it's more difficult to, once these emotions have like kind of seeped in, to claw your way back and make the right choice, or they kind of both solve each other?
um I think yeah, they're probably both as hard as each other, to be honest. Perhaps it maybe it actually is easier to avoid the passions in the first place, because I think maybe there's easy steps you can take. Like, that's the first line
Yeah,
of defense, and like by the time it's got past that, it's kind of like a snowball falling down a hill, like rolling down
yeah,
the hill and turning into avalanche or whatever. Like, it's that kind of idea. Like, once it catches some momentum, then by the time it gets to the last line of defense, it's going to be maybe
even
more
stronger and
difficult
harder to defeat.
to control. Yeah. So, but obviously they're both important, and can be, and it can be easy to allow passions to slip in, because you might not think you might think, oh, I'm not actually doing anything wrong by entertaining these passions and allowing them to seep in, because my actions aren't wrong, but they can maybe sneak in without you noticing. The same way emotions can, but the same way you feel emotions, but you don't necessarily have conscious control over them. Maybe these passions, maybe you could have had conscious control, but for whatever reason you didn't. It went over your head, like you weren't conscious of it, as conscious as you maybe could have been. But given that, we still have control over our actions. What do you think is more difficult then, between kind of controlling your emotions towards the start, compared to just being able to ignore your emotions and control your actions regardless of them?
I'd say the second one. Actually, no, I'd say the first one is probably more difficult, but that I think humans, like every human, has the ability to, maybe through like meditation or some sort of like spiritual awakening, they can kind of block out those like emotions, and then I think people can get to a point of that, but then even if you're at that point, everyone will still struggle with the second line of defense, which is doing the right thing. So maybe the first one's more difficult, but everyone has the ability to kind of work towards dealing with them better, like blocking out the emotions altogether. And then the second line of defense, well, just even from like a military standpoint, like if someone's got through your first line of defense, they've advanced towards you and they're in a stronger position. So it's going to be harder to defeat them because you've got one less line of defense. So the second one would be more difficult overall.
Yeah, that makes sense. It comes back to what we were talking about last episode, about how developing more awareness, through meditation, we were talking about in the last episode, that if you become more aware of these thoughts coming in, you can intercept them on the way in, so to speak, and you stop them from growing and taking control of you. So yeah, I think that's definitely important and something people can work towards. But maybe I feel like maybe the actions are more fundamental, because at the end of the day, like regardless of the emotions you feel, the actions are what really matter. So if you were to act in a proper way, even if you let the passion slip in, then you'll still be doing the right thing if you take the right action, because that's the most important thing. I think the other thing about building that strength to take the right action, regardless of the emotions you feel, is so important, because it creates this feedback loop. So you feel certain emotion and then you take an action, and because you took that action, you feel another emotion. So if you allow the initial emotions to allow you to take a negative action, then that will spiral back your emotion. It will be reinforced in your emotions, and you're more likely to take that action again. Whereas regardless of the emotion you feel, if you take the proper action, I feel like that feeds back into the emotions you feel and makes you more likely to take the proper action. Right. So I think developing that capacity to take the right action regardless, and that's what self-discipline is at a fundamental level. What everyone talks about, self-discipline, that's the ability to take the proper action regardless of the emotions you feel. And then one step removed from that, obviously we'd like to be able to control our emotions better, and that can be done through more awareness, but obviously both are really important.
Yeah, I think maybe Stoics, from what we've said with the definition of it, maybe Stoics would say the second one's more difficult, because we don't control what happens to us. We don't control what emotions our body feels, but we do control how we react to them.
Yeah.
So maybe that's not necessarily the more difficult one, but it's the more important task.
Yeah. Let's dive a bit more deeply into that. So this idea of what is in your control versus what isn't in your control. So we kind of spoke about that specifically in terms of whether your emotions / passions / actions are in your control. But it comes back to, the way a lot of people view the world is, like they're so emotionally invested in the things outside of their control. So there's I made a couple of little lists here of, from a video that I saw, about things that are outside your control versus what's in your control. And basically the idea of Stoicism is to base your emotions on things inside your control, not outside your control. So things outside your control, which a lot of people base their self-worth and happiness on, are the actions and opinions of other people, your health, your reputation, and your wealth. So there are some examples. And I wanted to discuss, because I think there is some importance in having external goals to drive you and to motivate what you do, whereas
Yeah.
philosophy of Stoicism kind of purely focuses on, it completely neglects those external things. Have you got any thoughts on that sort of tension there between maybe it being
Yeah, I
a good or
remember
bad thing?
there was like there's a book called The Four Agreements. It's pretty widely known. I can't remember who the author is. I don't remember every four agreement, but the one that like kind of stuck out to me that I kind of had a bit of disagreement with was it was something along the lines of like one of the agreements was don't take anything personally when anyone like kind of attacks you or says anything to you. And I thought that's a good idea because you want to be able to understand that people would usually negatively comment on you because of like the reflection they feel on themselves. But then I thought about it, and I remember Jordan Peterson talking about the value of understanding how society sees you. Like if you don't understand, if you don't take anything personally, then you're not going to necessarily take the external input. I mean, the external judgment of who you are into account for your own actions. So if I'm not going to have any consideration for what someone thinks of me, I'm just going to do what I think is right. But how do I determine what's right to do if I'm only getting that? If I'm only coming up with what's right from my own viewpoint? Like, there's such a value in understanding other people's views and like what they think should be done and what they shouldn't be done. That like I think it's necessary to. I think it's necessary to have external like people tell you this is right, this is wrong, and then you use them to make your own mind up.
Yeah, it's got. I guess it's got to be a combination of both between your own views, and the opinions you've come up with on your own versus what your feedback from other people, because it kind of denies like the fundamental way humans learn on like the most basic level, is we take an action, we watch the response, and then if it's a positive response, it's positively reinforced. If it's negative response, it's negatively reinforced. And perhaps this philosophy somewhat neglects, it can be useful when gauging, am I taking the right action? Like it is useful to compare like your desired outcome with the outcome from the world, and then you can learn from that. Whereas if you're purely in this isolated environment, then it can be hard to really judge, like, okay, well, what am I comparing it to? Have I made any progress here? If you don't have any concrete goals or like to compare the outcomes to, then it can be difficult. But perhaps like it does make sense to kind of neglect it on the fact that it is outside your control, so you can take the right actions and not necessarily get the exact rewards you want because the fact is out of your control. But you should take the actions. You should like take pride maybe in the actions rather than in the outcomes. And something this made me think of was, I don't know if you've read it, the book Atomic Habits.
No, I've not.
But it makes this point of, I think I can't remember exactly how I put it, but it basically said like you need to prioritize systems over goals. So you focus on the system. So what am I doing on a daily basis to, I guess, to work towards a long-term goal, but the emphasis on the system. I'll be happy and fulfilled if I execute correctly on the system, not on whether I'll get this goal. And that's supposedly a more stable and sustainable way of motivating yourself to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So that kind of links into the philosophy, but there's definitely a tension there.
Yeah, sort of references what we talked about the other day when we talked about delayed gratification, the instant gratification. If you delay your gratification and focus on the process of getting to that point where you can enjoy the gratification, you'll become more fulfilled, rather than just focusing on the outcome, which is the gratification and enjoyment. But I
Yeah,
mean, one thing I'll say, sorry, did you want to?
yeah, I was just about to say that it reminds me of something that Andrew Human talks about, how like there was this post. I took a screenshot of it because I really liked it. I'll read it out. But the key thing to optimizing dopamine is to be sure the reward you experience is scaled with the effort to obtain it. It's also good idea to randomly delete the reward every once in a while, but this was the main bit that related to it. Effort for reward's sake is truly and positively effort for effort's sake, sorry, is truly and positively transformative. So like if you're able to gain pleasure from the effort itself, you focus on the effort, which going back to this Stoic philosophy is the actions that you take, that you gain pleasure from taking the right actions. Then yeah, that's what you want. Whereas if you always focus on the external goal, then yeah, it's probably not as good.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what we talked about with like the idea of, is external input good, or should you kind of focus on what you think's right? Could you argue that Stoicism is more like an individualistic philosophy rather than like a collectivist philosophy? Like that, like would, I'm not saying this is how Stoics like view people and like the world, but could you argue that if someone followed this philosophy, they might fall into they might fall into the thinking of, even if what I'm doing is wrong, and other people, even if what other people are doing is wrong, because they are acting out what they think is right without any input from society, that is kind of like the true nature of that human. So they are becoming a true Stoic. So it's more the individual is doing what they think is right, rather than subscribing to what society says they should do.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there, but I think what were the virtues again? Was one of the virtues?
Courage, so courage, having the bravery to do these sort of things, it's kind of self-explanatory. Then there's temperance, which is kind of like moderation, taking everything in moderation, and not being like excessive.
As opposed to
And then there was
indulgence.
justice. Pardon?
As opposed to indulgence, like the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's justice, which is kind of, I guess, just doing the right thing and making sure you act out with your virtues. And then wisdom, just being a lifelong learner and listener, and trying to take in as much knowledge as you can.
Yeah, that's like, because I wanted to know like if there was any related to helping people, because I do think like I watched this video by the Daily Stoic, and he was talking about how one of the biggest like he made a couple of points about how like part of the Stoic philosophy is to put other people and to do things for other people. So the example he gave was I can't remember exactly what the events were in the Roman Empire, but Marcus Aurelius, it was bad and people were struggling, and Marcus Aurelius walks into like, I don't know, his house or some shit. I can't remember. And then he just starts picking up all the expensive things, and he's like, we're going to sell these because we need to, like, I don't need these materials possessions because people are struggling, and I'm doing this for the greater good. So I
think there was like a plague or something that was just ravaging like the whole empire, and he said, let's just sell everything and give it to the people that need it.
Yeah, so that's like, I think it is part of the Stoic philosophy to help other people and to do things for other people. But I can understand how, if like the point you were making, that if you're completely your values are completely isolated from other people, then you can maybe come up with this value system that isn't conducive with helping other people.
Yeah, it's more considered around yourself and more selfish, rather than taking other people's like emotions or well-being into account. I mean, that's not to say though, if someone was just truly individualistic and said, these are my morals and these are my actions because of my morals, that's not to say that that person isn't going to be like a philanthropist or someone that helps their community.
Yeah,
because I guess it just comes down to like the individual and like their biology or genetics or like their nature.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to a more broad question of where do our morals come from, which, you know, I think we spoke about this a fair bit in the earlier episodes about how people might say, yeah, you can kind of realize the values yourself, and that's maybe what Nietzsche puts forward. But perhaps as a pushback to that kind of brings up this argument that no values actually exist, and that you could come up with a philosophy of basically anything because there aren't any real values. Whereas I lean more towards that are, like, as humans there are innate values that is good and evil is somewhat, it's hard to say, it's like it maybe a subjective truth to what they are. Like, you can't just arbitrarily come up with what you think is good and bad, because there's something fundamental about values. So to come up with, like, it would be a poor moral. So one of the things that Stoics say is in equal control is your moral judgment, and it would be a poor moral judgment to say I'm going to do self-serving things at the expense of other people. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, I saw like a little headline yesterday in the news or today, and it was talking about the UK government and how Liz Truss has basically just like fucked up the budget, and people think she should probably resign. And like the headline was kind of, I think it went along the lines of like, is it evil or incompetence? Like, even if people do bad things that affect other people in a negative way, is that necessarily because they're evil or because they're just incompetent and like not understanding of what their actions like can lead to? Or
Yeah.
is there a true evil that does like wean itself through the world and like takes control of people?
Yeah, I heard. Well, I think there certainly is an evil. Like, people, there are people who are evil. They do things to create suffering on innocent people, and like, that's an example of something which I think is unarguably evil. But he said whether incompetence is a valid excuse for evil, and I don't think it is. I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this sort of thing, and I think he said, like, if you're the owner or CEO of a company and people in the company are doing something illegal, for example, you even if you don't know about it, as it's your responsibility to know. So the fact that you didn't, I think they do. I mean, I'm not a fucking expert on law, but I think, like, there is something to be said for like, not knowing is not a not
It's not
you
a valid
don't get
reason
to
for your
escape. Yeah,
innocence.
you don't get to escape it morally. What were we going to say?
Sorry, like not knowing is not a valid reason for your innocence.
Yeah, it's like willful. It comes back to maybe willful blindness.
Yeah,
Like, that is not an excuse, because you maybe could have known. So
I mean you could easily get into a massive conversation about these large corporations. Like, are they just too big? Like some like the big ones have like tens of thousands, some of them like hundreds of thousands of employees around the world. Like, how is it able for a board of 10 to 20 directors to be able to really understand what is going on in their company and make sure that everything's like validated and by the books? Like, is it possible to do that on such a large scale?
yeah, it is difficult. So, like what you said there, so it's incompetence. I'd say incompetence isn't as much of a, what's like the opposite word for virtue? Opposite word to virtue.
Um, de virtue, in virtue, what are those?
Is it what is say virtue?
I guess it just would be bad virtue, wouldn't it?
Yeah, vice. They put it as vice. I was kind of thinking that,
Right.
but basically, the like evil of itself, like deliberate evil, is a bigger vice, so to put it, than incompetence. But incompetence is still a negative
Right.
morally.
I guess like I guess incompetence is still in one's control. So it is their responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's right. But obviously, it's not as bad as complete evil. But maybe there's a murky area between those two where you could have incompetent people who were put into a difficult position and did their best, but you could also have incompetent people who were willfully blind and who could have known and who could have solved the problems, but they chose not to for their own sake because it was easier not to, or there was some other benefit there. So that would be a worse form of incompetence morally. But whether incompetence on its own, innocent of willful blindness, yeah, I don't know, but perhaps that indicates you've taken on more responsibility than you should. But it's a difficult problem, to be fair.
Yeah, I guess maybe in like, is there a blurry line between willful blindness and evilness? Because like the difference is the evilness has like an intention from the outset of there will be suffering for other people for my own enjoyment or for my own gain, whereas willful blindness, maybe they know that there's suffering that will happen for other people, but there's no intention for that suffering to happen because of their own actions. So maybe that's where the blurry line could be blurriest.
It's interesting thinking about this because it kind of made me think back to, okay, what morally matters? Is it so the Stoic philosophy is kind of about, regardless of anything else, it's your actions that matter. But I don't think that's completely like comprehensive in terms of giving like a moral framework, because like, for example, the law system, intent does matter. So like with murder, there's first degree, second degree murder based on the intent, and that is actually a factor which goes into it. So does intent matter? Yeah, I think intent does matter, maybe even if the actions are the same. But I
guess the actions put you into that position where the question of intent arises. Whereas if you take the right actions in the first place, you're not going to put yourself into that murky water.
Yeah, that's true. And coming back, if we circle back to the actions, like I think part of the Stoic philosophy, like when I first discovered it a few years ago, that helped me the most was sort of, when you adopt it, its ability to remove anxiety and remove negative emotions. So the way I would put it was like when you focus purely on things that are in your control, which is, you can argue how much your emotions you control, but pretty much your own actions. If it is in your control, then you can take the proper action for the best out, based on your understanding of the situation, which is all you have in your control. You can take the best action for the best outcome, and at that point, the best outcome will come. So there's no need to worry. Worrying won't make a difference. And then if events are outside your control, then there's no need for anxiety because you don't have control. Like, it's not going to make a difference to the situation. There's no need to needlessly suffer. So using that, so practically trying to think about occurrences like, okay, when something bad happens, and this even goes for things that were in your control in your past, but you made a mistake. So you can't control your actions in the past. You can't determine what the future will be. You control your actions in the present. And I think that removes the need for anxiety.
Right. Yeah, I remember, I don't know if you referenced it in the podcast yet. There's a good quote by some ancient philosopher. He says, worrying about the past will make you depressed, and worrying about the future will make you anxious, whereas worrying about what's happening now or being present in the moment will make you at peace, will give you peace.
Yeah.
So I guess Stoicism is like, I remember like someone referenced, like said that Marcus Aurelius always stated like everything you should do should be done with conviction, no matter what it is, and there should be a thought out reason for why you're doing it.
Yeah.
But then, like, I guess maybe does that get into the conversation of delayed gratification v instant gratification? Like, is that sustainable for a whole lifetime?
I think as a general rule, actions which are consciously chosen will be better than ones which are chosen otherwise, because otherwise will most likely be impulsive. But it's basically that most people don't take the time. It's similar to the ideas from Nietzsche about the higher man, how most people aren't. So when I say the higher man in this context, I mean about considering their own values rather than the values of everyone else. Most people don't take the time to reconsider those which are obvious to them through social conformity that they go for. So the same idea is in Stoicism about how people would how they don't question their impulses and emotions, so they're not in control of their desires. We talked about the like the passions, that they're not in control of these passions, distress, lust, like these things. They think that these things just come onto them, whereas if you consciously practice that constraint, then you can actually have control over them. And but I guess it comes back to, so your point was about, do people have control? Wait, what was your point? Shit, sorry.
Like Marcus Aurelius said, everything that you do should be done with conviction. Then my question is that sustainable over a lifetime, or is it like unattainable?
Yeah, so the point I was making was that for most people, it won't be like to make conscious decisions all the time will be much more difficult, because they don't have this conscious control over their passions, which comes back to how we were saying it makes your actions more difficult to control. But I think if you can have a conscious awareness of your passions and use restraint to control your passions, then that makes it easier to take the proper actions. It comes back to this whole conversation about how sometimes your passions will seep through, but you can still take the proper action. But I do believe it is possible to make maybe not completely conscious decisions, but most of the time, and to take the proper action most of the time, because it comes back to how, I think we only briefly mentioned this actually, about how like the Stoic sage, like the Stoics talked about, I can't remember who it was, maybe it was Epictetus, but they said like no true Stoic actually exists, because that person would be closer to gods than to a human if they were at that sort of control. And that's very similar to the idea of the Übermensch by Nietzsche, about how you can never become the Übermensch, because at that point, like,
you're not human, almost.
Yeah, you're beyond human, but we should still strive towards that. And making conscious decisions is part of that, which we should strive towards. And obviously, we're not going to be able to do it all the time, because we're not perfect, but you can try to.
Yeah, well, like moreover on that point, I remember like Ryan Holiday saying, like, he says like the philosophy is vibrant and it's inspiring, and it's challenging you to be who you're meant to be. And it made me think of like a conversation I had with my cousin Rion, and like we were talking one day about like just the direction of our lives, where we could end up. And he said something that I interpreted along the lines of like, he kind of believes that everyone has predetermined roles and pathways in life, sort of akin to like the idea of destiny and fate. People will end up where they were always going to be. But like this Stoic philosophy sort of seems to think that Stoicism sort of seems to think that it can help people find and awaken the better version of themselves. But is it possible for everyone to become like a better version of themselves? And I'm like, that kind of got me into the question of, is there such thing as destiny and predeterminism, or do we actually have free will and the ability to change our course in
Yes, I looked into a bit into this before the podcast, and to be honest, I wasn't like too keen to get too deep into it, because getting into like the nitty and gritty of the philosophy, like whether it believes in predeterminism and how much conscious control, like I thought maybe for the podcast, we'll focus more on like the moral points that we can discuss and how to live proper life, because and I wouldn't want to relay it wrong, like the beliefs of Stoicism, but in the video I watched before, it's talking about how predeterminism, like Stoicism kind of does believe in a certain predeterminism, but it's still like I didn't fully understand like how much it believed in predeterminism, but basically it kind of comes back to the events of the external world. Like there, you can't control them, they are predetermined, but somehow we still have this conscious control over our actions in terms of how to respond to them. So this comes back to the idea of focusing fully what's on your control, which is your response and your actions and your attitude towards the things that come your way. But like all you can control is your actions, given them and the best course of action based on the predetermined external events. But yeah, it's kind of foggy, I think, how like whether Stoicism believes in predeterminism or not. Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, maybe even if it doesn't believe in, maybe if it doesn't believe in free will, the act of like subscribing to the act of trying to carry out what the philosophy means would kind of get you to a point of free will. I don't know. That doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, I did actually write something here. So it believes in this kind of version of determinism called like soft determinism, which I think basically believes that there is some control we have over our own minds, which isn't predetermined. But I mean that those two things don't really make sense. I don't think I've explained that properly.
Yeah, we'll leave that to the experts like Sam.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, we could have a whole podcast about talking about predeterminism and free will and stuff. Maybe we'll do that at some point. But yeah, but I think like the way I kind of think about predeterminism is I kind of do believe in it on an ultimate like physics level. Like physically, everything is like we're not as humans, we're not free from the physical laws of the universe, and in that sense, it's predetermined. But that when you look at things like that, it's so far removed from the subjective level that subjectively and practically it is useful to talk in terms of like subjectively and practically we do have free will, the decisions we make do matter, even though on like a physical level that isn't technically true. So I think it comes back like people do have the ability to make their own choices and things and to be conscious about their actions, but similar to
I guess you're restricted by physics. Like you can't just choose to fly one day.
yeah. And I think ultimately we are probably at the will of predetermined physical law, and that we don't actually have free will on a physical, like we don't transcend the physical laws of the universe. But I think that perspective is so like objective and scientific and on such a perspective far away from what we actually experience as humans that it's not really practical to speak in those terms. But yeah, it's just a complicated one, isn't it? I don't know. Perhaps there is some sort of divine element to us which does transcend physical laws, but I'm not sure.
It'd be nice if there was.
It'd be nice, but does it really matter? It kind of feels like there is, and the way we experience the world kind of is as if that's true, which perhaps is actually more relevant than getting so abstract about
it. I guess even if it was real, it wouldn't matter because we'd never be able to experience it in this form of life. So it doesn't matter to us in this form of life because there's only experience of it after this life has ended. So there's no point in letting the spiritual realm. I don't know. Is there any point in letting the spiritual realm and the idea of it impact the choices that you make today? Because we're not in the spiritual realm, and like they might not abide by the same laws of physics or the same way of living that we do.
Well, maybe it comes back to this. You can apply the Stoic philosophy here. It doesn't matter. I mean, there are things you don't know and you can't necessarily control that. There are things in the future that you can't control. There are things in the past that obviously you can't change, but you can ultimately always just focus on your present actions. So perhaps you shouldn't allow those sort of things to affect your decisions. And that maybe kind of brings us into like another key like part of Stoicism, which I think the statement is like memento mori, which is like you are going to die. So I think quite a key part of Stoicism is constantly reminding yourself that you're going to die and aiming on like seizing the day. So do you have anything to add to that in terms of like what Stoicism believes in, and what are your own personal thoughts on embracing death?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think about it too much throughout my day or throughout my life, really. I mean, it could pop into like the mind every now and then. Like, I'll probably be dead in like 50 years, but I never really think about it in terms of, oh, I could die tomorrow. Like, I think about it, but I don't actually deep it in a way that alters the way I'm feeling in that moment. Like, there's always a risk of like waking up, going to school, being poisoned by some sort of shit, or being bombed, or like getting hit by a car. But those thoughts don't really impact the way I'm feeling that day. And I think like if I was, or if one was to really think about the consequences of dying and how that just changes how much time you have in your life left, there's such a risk of just going into nihilism. Like, if I'm going to die, what's the point in doing anything that's worthwhile, that leaves a legacy or kind of has long-lasting impacts?
To be honest, yeah, it's interesting you say that because I feel like like Stoicism promotes, like it talks about you should think about death all the time. Basically, you should remember that you're always going to die, but it kind of does the opposite. I think death, like the finitude of life, kind of gives each action you take more of a meaning, because if you had forever, then maybe it wouldn't matter so much, whereas you don't have forever.
Right.
And it kind of breeds this passion and this motivation to like take action, because like you need to seize the day. Like you have a limited time here, and you can't waste that. Maybe, yeah, well, you can't waste that. You should try and take that as much as possible. I think what the Stoic philosophy promotes is like using I know one thing that they do is taught. Well, I've heard people say in the context of Stoic philosophy that you should do like negative visualizations, like imagine terrible things happening, imagine you dying, your loved ones dying, to kind of put things into perspective for you, to actually give you a sense of urgency, because perhaps it's easy to go through life and not have that sense of urgency and just go day by day not really thinking much of it. But when you take away, when you realize that your time is finite, you realize how valuable every single day is, because you could die tomorrow.
Right.
And it says like when you do things, you should do everything as if it's the last thing you're going to do, like trying to like follow the highest virtue and excellence as if your life depends on it, pretty much. As yeah, so I think, yeah, what do you think about that? Because you said perhaps, and I definitely see your point that you can, if you obsess about death, it can breed nihilism. But do you think it can actually do the opposite as well?
Yeah, like listening to the way you put it, it does make sense. If we only have finite time, simply because something's finite, it does become more valuable. That's why like gold's so precious and like sought after. But then like one of the points you said later on is doing everything as if it's like the last thing you do. If I knew I was going to die in an hour, I don't really think I'd be doing uni work. I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
I'd probably just
that's
go
an
off.
interesting thing, because it kind of, I think a lot of people think, like on the surface of it, when it comes up, you think default to hedonism, instant gratification because there isn't gratification to delay for because you don't have time.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I'm not
yeah,
saying that Stoicism is egotistical at all, but if you're performing actions as if it's the last thing you do, Stoics are trying to say you should do actions based on the four virtues because they're good things. Why would the last thing that you do matter if it was good or bad? Would it only matter if it was good or good because you want people to remember you in a good way? So is that like an ego thing? I know obviously Stoics are kind of all about breaking down the ego, but like to me that kind of just a little bit.
yeah. That is an interesting point because when you think about like if you ask someone the question, oh, if you only had like an hour to live or a day to live, then it does default to immediate gratification. But the Stoics talk about like doing everything as if it's the last thing you'll ever do. But why would you put effort into something if there was no
Reward that's going to come straight
reward?
away.
Yeah, it's a difficult question.
Unless the reward is because you're doing a good thing that will have positive, long-lasting benefits that ultimately serve the community and the people around you.
Yeah,
And that's not with the intention of people remembering you in high esteem, but it's with the intention of good things just happening to people around you and stuff like that, maybe.
yeah.
So maybe it's more of a selfless thing rather than a selfish thing.
Yeah, or just to be like for to try and spend your last moments being trying to embody like your ideals is the proper way of spending your last moments rather than spending your last moments descending into hedonism to embody your ideals. The last thing that you do is like somehow perhaps morally the thing to do, but it is interesting because it does talk about this idea a lot of thinking, yeah, you could die tomorrow, you could, but without it requires some thinking to actually, or perhaps if you think about it too much and you rationalize it, like you can't, like if you think, oh well, in an hour it's not going to matter because I'll be dead, like maybe you're missing the point because the point is living your life in a virtuous way in the moment. So to think that time would have been better spent feeling pleasure, perhaps is the wrong ideal. You should act in accordance with the ideals of the higher man or the stoic sage or whoever you want to aspire to be like, rather than spending your last moments trying to deny the suffering of life, because we spoke about how to pursue pleasure and comfort and things like that is to try and fight away death and fight away suffering, whereas you should spend that time of your life rather than trying to fight those things, but to accept those things, but to act in a virtuous way regardless, maybe.
Yeah, maybe the idea of doing things as if it's your last thing you do, maybe we're dissecting it too much, and it's kind of like ultimately no one knows what the future holds, so no one's actually going to be able to guarantee they'll be dead after this action that is completed, and it's more so about the process of doing a virtuous thing will eventually lead to a better life.
Yeah,
so maybe it's a bit of an analogy or a metaphor.
Yeah,
that's kind of just got some face value rather than, oh, if you're going to die, what are you going to do?
Yeah. It's interesting though, because like we spoke so much about instant gratification, delayed gratification in the previous episode, but like why delay gratification if there is no long term? It's an interesting thing. I'm gonna go away and think about that after the episode and see. I'm sure there'll be some interesting things that come up from that. But that kind of brings us to like talking about death. It brings us to like talking about suffering and letting go of your vices, and I'm using vices not in the terms of like opposite to virtue, but well, I guess they are kind of the same thing, but vices in terms of things you hold on to, things you think you need, materialistic things we spoke about during, like, what was it, the plague or some shit.
Yeah.
Like when he walked into the wherever and started getting rid of all the materialistic shit you don't need. And we spoke about this a lot in the Fight Club episode, how letting go of those things that you don't need, those materialistic things which offer you comfort but aren't essential, like gives you a level of freedom, and it's kind of because you have complete agency over your own minds and no one can take that away from you. So being able to let go of things is important.
Yeah, I think there's like a Buddhist saying attachment is like attachment is like one of the true causes of suffering. Like when you attach yourself to physical possessions, and like when you attach yourself to like other human beings, when you're like in love or you have love for family members and you lose that person or you lose that relationship, the attachment is what causes you to suffer. And it's obviously true, but it's such a difficult road to walk down, of trying to go through life and not attach yourself to things. Because then when it comes to your like system of values, do you not attach yourself to that system of value? There's those systems of values, and if like one of those values is meaningful relationships with people around you, how is it like improbable that you will not get attached?
Yeah, I've heard Stoicism criticized for this sort of thing, because I think, I'm not sure whether it's a passage from like Marcus Aurelius Meditations or some other Stoipius for writing, but it was talking about how, like, if your daughter dies or something, you should be like emotionally detached from that. And the way they see it, like the way I've heard it put is, you shouldn't view things as taken away from you or that you've lost them, but simply that they've returned to the original state that they were before you had them. So you haven't lost it; it's returned.
Yeah,
But I think, like, Stoicism can be criticised for complete neglection of emotion and attachment. And I think Nietzsche actually criticised, although I feel like there's a lot of similarities between Nietzsche's way of viewing the world and Stoicism in terms of aiming to be like the higher man type of thing. He criticised it for complete rejection of like the passions and, like, I guess attachment would maybe fall into one of the passions, as an essential part of life, like Stoicism neglects that. So that's potentially a criticism. But what do you think about that criticism of Stoicism?
I think it's a valid criticism, but maybe in real, like when you think about it in context, Stoicism was like ancient Greece time. Back then, it was like pretty common that everyone you loved died quite young. Not everyone, but it's quite common that child mortality was quite high. People died from diseases and stuff that the modern world doesn't have to face. Well, we still face them, but we overcome those challenges through like modern science and technology. So maybe back then it was more relevant to detach yourself from your loved ones, because if you were attached to your loved ones, you'd just be fucking depressed because everyone you know died suddenly or died younger than they should. So I think it maybe had a lot more relevance back then than it does today. But even saying that, I did quite like the way, did you say Marcus Aurelius put it, that you're not losing a person, they're simply returning to the form they were before they were with you. That's quite a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I've got this. I've got a mug which on it says, "Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened," and that just that just reminds me of that a little bit. But
it's quite very similar.
Yeah, it's similar. But let me ask you a question then. So, like, do you think so? So the goal of Stoicism is, through this detachment, you create a state of complete inner tranquility, regardless of external circumstances. Is that true? Is that state of tranquility truly worth the sacrifice of your attachment to outside things? Like, is that a sacrifice which is worth it, or would it be worth it to accept a level of like inner, non tranquility, inner turmoil, for the sake of being able to experience like more of the passions of life and attachment. Perhaps there's some positive you feel from that, which if you completely deny it, then you don't get that positive side to it.
Yeah. All right. So is a state of tranquility and being attached to nothing, like truly, better than allowing yourself to be attached to stuff, with along with that though suffering when that attachment is taken away?
Yeah.
I mean, the first part of the question kind of makes you think, if you're just completely tranquil with everything that happens, there isn't suffering in your life. And like, I do believe that suffering is a part of life, and possibly like large meaning of what a large part of what makes life meaningful. But then when you think about the first part of the question, even with that tranquility and the process to getting there, you're still suffering because you don't allow yourself to have those attachments. But would you suffer more in the latter part? Because it's always harder to lose something rather than to never have had it. And in terms of answering it in a straight way, I'd say the second part of the question is more admirable, like allowing yourself to become attached and have this suffering that comes along with it is what it means to be human in my mind. And but you can, along with that, you can still take some stoic practices and react and choose your actions based on what is virtuous rather than based on how you emotionally feel.
Yeah. There's different, like, yeah, it's a tough one. It's a really tough one. But perhaps, yeah, to deny the attachment to things might be denying part of your humanity, which, for the sake of inner peace, perhaps you'd be willing to suffer for the highs and lows slightly more. I guess it's a trade-off between, do I want to be constantly content, or do I want to experience some of the highs and lows?
But it gets into the question of, like, if you're happy all the time, how do you determine what you're happy? Because you have nothing to compare it to that tells you that you're happy.
Yeah, and well, I think this idea of tranquility is very similar to the ideas of contentment we were talking about when we were talking about meditation in the last episode. So you're not pursuing this elated, happy feeling. But you just realize, like, when you're able to let go of attachment, whether that be to things that you lose, like we're talking about in the context of Stoicism, or attachment to like your own thoughts and perceptions, which is maybe more the side that meditation would encourage the detachment from. But when you're able to let go of that attachment, you can have complete contentment in that moment, and there's nothing that can deny that, because any thought that denies that is just another layer of this experience that you are detached from. So you have that tranquility, and that's what Stoicism aims to build. Like, through that tranquility, you have complete calmness in the there's a quote from this video I saw, which was, tranquility in the midst of struggles, joy in the midst of hardship. So regardless of the external circumstances, you have that, you're calm and content. But yeah, that is an argument to be had for the other side of it. And I think perhaps this was Nietzsche's criticism of it, that to completely deny the passions isn't the proper way to live. That, there's a saying that I like, which is, it's better to have loved and lost than it is to have never have loved at all.
My dad loves that saying, just because he's single.
Big up Ian. But it's true, like, you need to, like, perhaps the highs are it's worth having the lows for the sake of the highs. But
yeah.
But
then, like,
I don't know.
If you apply that to if you apply that to, maybe it's a little bit abstract, but if you apply that to like a scientific neurological like sense, you want your dopamine level to kind of be a bit more consistent rather than spiking, because then the low goes lower. and spiking, and then the low goes even lower than that? Or is that kind of just a bit too abstract to apply to
No,
human
that I think that
emotion?
is actually, yeah, that is definitely a parallel there. But I think even with the dopamine thing, like there is still that is still a trade-off. Like, for example, some people who struggle with like the ups and downs of dopamine are like athletes. So, but like you watch fucking like Conor McGregor knock out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds, run up onto the cage, celebrating his win of the world championship. Like you can talk, maybe there was a low after that, but you can't take that away from him. That's like,
Yeah,
you can't take that moment away from him, regardless. So perhaps, and I think a lot of times greatness does come at the expense of, like, you will have the highs and the lows if you're pursuing greatness, because it's like a high stakes game, you might put it. But
yeah,
whether that's worth it or not, we could we could talk for hours about that from different angles.
yeah,
And but probably, like, I feel like maybe the answer of these things is always some combination of both. Um,
yeah. I've sort of learned that the last few years. It's literally just go down the middle, and you're pretty much sound.
yeah, but sometimes you need to go to the extremes to realize that perhaps people could benefit from going, and it depends on what stage in life you are. If you're in like a rocky stage of life, a lot of ups and downs, perhaps fully committing to a stoic philosophy where you allow yourself to detach from the things that cause you suffering and to only focus on your own personal actions, like, though you might, like, that can help you get through some difficult times, but perhaps there are other times in your life where you might want to embrace those things.
Yeah,
But the thing about going down the middle is I kind of question whether you get, like, do you get the best of both worlds, or do you not get the best of either?
uh, to
Like,
kind of get the benefit of it, you need to dive in and
yeah,
like fully live it out. Whereas if you just dip your toes, you kind of just get in
to
to
live
dip toe
live the
benefit.
full benefits, yeah. But
That's
perhaps
interesting.
perhaps it's
Maybe the middle. Maybe when you say going down the middle, that could mean the average, but the actual points of action are at the extreme of both, and it just averages out to down the middle. If that makes sense. When I refer to like down the middle, maybe it doesn't necessarily mean that you walk down the middle of this left and right side.
right, but you
Maybe
go
it means
between
that
them.
you,
Yeah,
yeah, you go down the right on the extreme, then you go down the left, but it just averages out towards the middle,
yeah,
like a distribution.
yeah. No, that's an interesting way of putting it. And another thought actually is, like, we talk about the higher man a lot, like assessing values for yourself. And that's kind of like what we're trying to do from our podcast, is have these conversations and realize, like, what the values that are true to ourselves. And perhaps at a certain point, like, the responsibility is on the individual to adopt a philosophy that they believe to be virtuous, and to live that out. So can we say one's right or wrong? Maybe
Yeah,
not, but maybe it's an individual
wow,
thing
there's
that
some,
people need to choose themselves, and that's what being high, like coming up with your own values. Like, you need to transcend just a default, and maybe if you go through your life and never know, if you constantly make an effort to consider these things and try and live in accordance with your values at the time, and constantly aim to live as high as possible to your values, as well as improving your values in themselves, then you're onto a winner, I reckon.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah,
I guess you would you say that there's two ways of measuring it. If like there's two ways of measuring the goodness of someone's belief in a philosophy. Like you can measure it on an individual level and then on like a societal level. Like individually, if someone is acting out what they believe to be the best philosophy, then that's amazing because they are a higher man by like definition. But on a societal level, if that philosophy has values that doesn't benefit other people other than the person that acts them out, then it's not necessarily defined. That's not necessarily a higher man. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
it's hard with these conversations about values like that, because because in order to, you can't make absolute statements, oh, this is right or this is wrong, because to say someone needs to come up with their own values, well, are those values right or wrong? Well, it's not, like, depends who you ask. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I need to go
Yeah,
soon, but yeah, this has been a really good episode. I think we need to, like, there's still so much more here to unpack.
yeah,
So
definitely.
we can definitely come back to these sort of topics, and I'm sure similar things will come up in future episodes. So yeah, any closing thoughts?
Uh, just one, just say, just to say, like, Stoicism, from what I can see, is just an amazing way of thinking. Even if you don't subscribe to the whole package, like, there's a lot in there that you can, like, dissect and, like, apply to your own life for what's happening to you, like, at this moment. So people should check it out and just
Yeah,
take
yeah,
what they think benefits them.
yeah. It's very powerful, particularly in terms of dealing with hardships, and just be building this kind of inner strength and inner peace. So yeah, uh, pretty sick stuff. Check out
Right.
the Daily Stoic.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening. Shout out to Ryan Holiday and Daily Stoic. It's currently 1:30 p.m. Well, nearly 1:31 now. So have a nice little run. We'll see you next time. Check us out on Spotify as well.
See ya.
Right.